does your crazy neighbor do to be labeled the crazy neighbor? Story 1. My neighbor is what I would call extra. She's always involved in some bizarre event. She's the type of person who sends emails to the entire neighborhood when she sees someone's garbage can not put out correctly on trash day. I mean, she once called the police because she saw me sweeping my front porch at 11 a.m. on a Saturday morning. She said it was too loud and disturbing the peace. The real kicker? She doesn't even have kids or pets, so there's really no excuse for her to be this on edge all the time. If you ask her for a favor, you're in for a rant about how she's too busy because the world is just so inconsiderate. Yet, she seems to always have time to report on what everyone else is doing. I try to keep my distance, but every now and then she'll send a friendly reminder about how I should trim my hedges. You'd think that in a whole neighborhood full of people, I'd find at least one who wasn't quite as. Story 2. Okay, so my crazy neighbor is definitely the type to pull stunts that make people shake their heads. He's the one who sets off fireworks at 3 a.m. during a random Tuesday. When I asked him why he does this, he said it was to keep the energy alive. He also has a collection of inflatable pool animals, which sounds harmless enough, but he leaves them on his lawn year-round. And don't even get me started on his Halloween decorations. Most people just do the typical cobwebs and fake tombstones, but no. His lawn looks like something out of a horror movie. A giant inflatable Frankenstein stands next to a plastic skeleton with an old rusty bicycle attached to its hands, like it's about to go for a ride. And if you think that's the end of it, he decided to light up his yard with blinking strobe lights in the middle of the night. I'm surprised the neighbors haven't formed a protest, but I guess we're all too afraid of what he might do next. Story 3. Oh, where do I even start with this one? My next-door neighbor, we'll call him Bob, has been labeled the crazy neighbor by everyone in the neighborhood. First off, he has a garden that is so extensive that it's practically overtaking his entire yard. We're talking flowers, vegetables, statues, you name it. And he talks to every single plant like it's his best friend. But that's not even the weird part. The weird part is that he keeps trying to crossbreed different plants to create super vegetables. He'll hand out tomatoes that are a mix of tomato and eggplant, promising they taste like a new flavor explosion. He's always leaving these bizarre hybrid plants in my mailbox. And the worst part is that I'm too nice to tell him I never wanted them. Bob also has this strange obsession with birdwatching. He has an entire area of his lawn dedicated to birdhouses. But what's really unsettling is that he tries to befriend the birds. He'll sit outside covered in birdseed while weirdly singing at them. The entire street has grown used to it, but it's hard not to stare when Bob's there, making bizarre bird noises and waving his arms in a bird-like fashion. Story 4. I have this neighbor who's made it his life's mission to improve the neighborhood. He's not a regular homeowner. He's more like an amateur architect who believes he knows exactly how everyone's home should look. He once showed up at my front door, clipboard in hand, and said that my porch railing didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. He recommended I rip it out and replace it with something more modern. When I politely refused, he took it upon himself to send me links to various websites for better options, and even printed out a couple of schematics. He didn't stop there. He went down the street, knocking on doors and telling everyone that their house lacked flair, or wasn't in harmony with the rest of the block. Some of us tried to confront him about his unsolicited opinions, but he's unfazed. He said he was just trying to help us reach our full potential as homeowners. After a while, we all just started pretending like we didn't see him when he approached. He eventually gave up on trying to redesign our homes, but we know he still drives around the neighborhood, judging silently from his car. Story 5. Let me tell you about my neighbor, Karen. She's got a dog, and she's obsessed with it, but not in a cute, takes-care-of-it kind of way. No. She treats that dog like it's a literal celebrity. She has this massive dog stroller that she pushes around like it's a baby, and when she goes for walks, she makes sure to update the neighborhood with a full rundown of what the dog's day has been like. She'll stop everyone and say, "Oh, today I fed Daisy her favorite organic kale chips, and she just loves to roll in the grass." She's been so energetic lately. What's even weirder is that Karen has started getting into a whole dog influencer thing. She sets up Instagram accounts for Daisy, complete with professional photo shoots in front of the house, holding tiny props like sunglasses or little bandanas. But here's the real kicker. Karen regularly throws parties for Daisy's special occasions like National Dog Day or Daisy's birthday, where she invites all the neighbors to celebrate. I know it sounds harmless, but imagine being handed a cupcake made of dog treats and being forced to pretend like it's normal. It's truly a sight to behold. Story 6. So, I've got this neighbor who's a bit of an enigma. He moved in a few years ago, and at first, everything seemed normal. Then, he started wearing what I can only describe as vintage adventurer outfits. We're talking cargo pants, boots, a utility belt with an array of odd gadgets, and a fedora like Indiana Jones. Every time I saw him outside, he was either crouched down like he was on a stakeout or exploring his backyard with a metal detector. But it didn't stop there. He got a parrot, not as a pet, but because he said it was his new research assistant. From there, things took a turn for the stranger. He built a makeshift fort in his backyard using old sheets and random lumber, claiming it was a reconnaissance post for his urban explorations. The most bizarre part? He started handing out pamphlets to the neighborhood, explaining how we were all living under surveillance by the government and how we needed to reclaim our privacy. He even left one for me under my doormat one day that detailed his field notes, including how he observed me watering my plants with a strange, ritualistic precision. I couldn't make this up if I tried. Everyone has their theories, but I can't figure out whether he's trolling or genuinely believes in this mission. I'm just waiting for the day he invites me on an adventure to find the hidden treasure he's been talking about. Story 7. There's this older lady who lives across the street, and she's definitely earned the title of crazy neighbor for reasons I'm still trying to fully understand. Every single day, without fail, she hosts tea time at exactly 2 p.m. She invites all the neighborhood cats. I mean, she sets up a small table in her front yard, pours tea into little cups, and arranges plates with tiny saucers full of catnip. She claims to be a cat whisperer and says she can communicate with the neighborhood cats through energetic vibrations. If you've ever been walking by, you've likely witnessed her sitting cross-legged on the ground, softly calling out to the cats while shaking a rattle. To be honest, it's one of the strangest things I've ever seen. She often comes over to my house and tells me, in all seriousness, that my cat has been giving her cryptic messages about my love life, my future career, and even my ability to make soup. At first, I thought she was just eccentric, but it's gone on for so long that I'm starting to wonder if she might actually know something. Last week, she sent me a handwritten note that said, "The future holds a great deal of lasagna for you." I'm still processing what exactly that means. I don't even like lasagna. Story 8. My neighbor Greg is that guy who gets really into random hobbies and then tries to involve the entire block. I've seen him go through at least 5 different phases, each more bizarre than the last. For a while, he got super into extreme ironing. Yeah, you read that right. He would set up ironing boards in the strangest locations, on top of the neighborhood's water tower, on the roof of his garage, once even at the top of a large oak tree. He'd have a whole set of equipment, including different colored irons and, of course, a crisp white shirt to iron. He'd stand there, in full gear, waving down at us like it was a regular afternoon activity. The whole thing was so strange that I had to look it up, and apparently, it's a real thing, though I'm not sure that's much of an excuse. But Greg didn't stop there. After extreme ironing, he decided to take up urban sheep herding, and he bought a small herd of sheep. He started walking them around the neighborhood, stopping at houses, and encouraging neighbors to pet them. When he decided that the neighborhood's infrastructure was flawed for the sheep, he tried to redesign the street with little sheep-safe crossing areas and even built a small pen in his front yard for grazing. Every couple of months, we would hear that Greg had gotten into something new, kite flying in the middle of winter, falconry, don't even ask, and most recently, medieval reenactments, where he has convinced half the block to participate in mock battles. It's as if Greg is constantly in search of the next extreme hobby that somehow makes him stand out. Story 9. This one's going to be hard to believe, but it's all true. There's a guy named Chad who lives 2 doors down from me. At first, he seemed like an ordinary guy. A little quiet, a little socially awkward. But then one day, he decided to build a giant maze in his backyard. We're talking huge. He cleared out the entire back half of his yard and erected towering walls made of wooden planks. He made it look like something straight out of a Maze Runner movie. The crazy part? He invited everyone in the neighborhood to try and solve it. We all thought it was a joke, but then he actually put up a sign in front of his house that said, "Come conquer my maze, find the hidden treasure." Well, curiosity got the best of me, and I went in to check it out. As soon as I stepped in, Chad locked the entrance and handed me a paper with a series of cryptic clues. Apparently, if you didn't solve the riddles in time, you couldn't leave until he released you. The maze was like a psychological game. There were mirrors, dead ends, trick doors, and Chad would be lurking somewhere in the maze, yelling random phrases to throw you off. There were several escape attempts by other neighbors, but we couldn't get out until Chad deemed us worthy. Eventually, the police showed up after someone got stuck for hours and called for help, and it ended up as a whole neighborhood incident. Chad later apologized, but you can still see the remnants of the maze in his backyard, and he swears he's going to try again, bigger and better next year. Story 10. I have a neighbor who has never seemed to quite understand that some things are meant to stay indoors. Her name's Betty, and she's absolutely obsessed with garage sales. But not just any garage sales. Betty will literally open her garage to display a random assortment of items every single weekend. The crazy part? She doesn't even sell anything. She'll have stacks of old newspapers, random broken electronics, half-empty paint cans, and even items she finds on the curb. People often stop by looking for deals, but Betty's philosophy is that everything is priceless to her. The weirdest part is that she gives everything away for free and insists that you take it. She claims it's for the universe, and that by receiving her goods, you are helping to balance the cosmic energy. At first, it was just a few strange trinkets being passed around, but it soon became a neighborhood ritual. People would stop by, hoping to find something useful, only to walk away with stacks of junk. Some days, she even gets into a weird performance art mode, where she'll dramatically declare that an old toaster is an artifact of great spiritual significance. One neighbor tried to refuse a rusted chair she was offering, and Betty almost cried, telling them, "Don't you see? This chair is a part of me." We've all learned to just nod, smile, and walk away with our strange free gifts. What's even weirder is that she's somehow become somewhat of a local legend, and people actually drive from other neighborhoods to check out her garage sales. No one can explain it, but it's become part of our lives. Story 11. I live next to a guy named Doug, who is constantly making a scene, but not in the usual ways. Doug is obsessed with improving the neighborhood, but in the strangest, most nonsensical ways imaginable. For the last year, he's been planting trees, hundreds of them. Sounds nice, right? Except he's been planting them in the most random, completely impractical places, like in the middle of the sidewalk, directly in front of other people's driveways, and even on the narrow patches of grass between houses. His reasoning? He wants to add shade to every area of the neighborhood. And not just any trees. He insists on planting exotic species he finds on the internet, meaning he's growing trees that belong in tropical climates, in the middle of a cold-weather suburb. We've all tried to approach him and explain that these trees are going to die in the winter, but he won't listen. And if you bring it up, he launches into these long, impassioned speeches about how nature needs to reclaim its space and how the community lacks greenery. The strangest part is, the trees have become somewhat of a hazard. In the middle of winter, the branches are dangerously heavy with snow, and we've all had to dodge falling twigs. Doug still walks around with a giant watering can like nothing is wrong, acting like he's the neighborhood's hero. If you ask him, he's on a mission to bring paradise to the streets. Story 12. There's a woman named Marcy who has lived in our neighborhood for as long as I can remember. On the surface, she seems harmless. She's always smiling, waving at people, and offering unsolicited advice. But as time goes on, you start to realize that there's a bizarre consistency to her behavior that makes her stand out. Every Sunday without fail, she hosts a lawn gnome parade. Now, this wouldn't be so weird except for the fact that Marcy owns hundreds of gnomes. She lines them up on her front lawn, dresses them in different outfits, from pirate costumes to ballerina tutus, and then starts a parade around her property. The neighbors try to avoid eye contact with her, while she prances around with a megaphone, shouting things like, "The gnomes are ready to march. Who's going to lead them today?" The best part? Marcy invites anyone who will listen to join her. She gives people a gnome to carry and leads them around her yard, chanting things like, "Hail the mighty gnome." She even holds contests for the best-dressed gnome, offering the winner a strange prize, usually something like a jar of pickled eggs or a tiny ceramic mushroom. No one knows how or why this tradition started, but now it's a fixture in our neighborhood. You can set your watch to it. 2 p.m. sharp, gnomes are marching, and we're all just waiting for it to end. Story 13. I have this neighbor, Dave, who is, to put it bluntly, obsessed with squirrels. It started out harmless enough. He put a few bird feeders in his yard, but it didn't take long for him to realize that the squirrels were eating everything. So, he decided to outsmart them by setting up a complex system of squirrel obstacle courses. Now, every morning, he spends hours in his front yard building and adjusting these elaborate contraptions, each designed to stop squirrels from raiding his bird feeders. We're talking ramps, tunnels, spinning wheels, and even ropes. Dave has become a local legend, known for creating what he calls Squirrel Olympics. Neighbors walk by and shake their heads as they watch him obsessively monitor the course, timing the squirrel's attempts to navigate it. He's even installed hidden cameras so he can watch the squirrel's attempts when he's not at home. And to make it even more bizarre, he built a scoreboard and keeps track of their performance. He's genuinely convinced that one day, he'll train a squirrel to complete the course faster than any of the others. And when that happens, he says he'll become famous. He's even started designing trophies with little squirrel figurines to hand out to the most talented squirrels, all while sending us neighborhood updates in the form of PowerPoint presentations. It's completely out of hand, and no one knows how to politely tell him that, well, he's probably losing his mind over squirrels. Story 14. We've got a guy named Martin living on the next block who thinks he's a master craftsman of sorts, though none of us can really figure out what exactly he's crafting. Martin's house has been under construction for the last 3 years. He's constantly adding new improvements that seem to have no purpose. For example, he recently built a spiral staircase leading to, well, nowhere. It's just a staircase that leads up to a section of the house with no doors or windows, and no one can figure out what it's. But that's not the weirdest part. Martin decided that the area under his porch would make a great underwater-themed living space, so he painted the walls a deep ocean blue, filled it with plastic sea creatures, and put in a fake sand floor. The best part? He insists that people come over and experience the underwater wonder. He'll host these bizarre dinner parties where you have to sit on the sand-covered floor, surrounded by seashells and fish tanks. He even wears a wetsuit while serving dinner, claiming it helps him stay in character. You're expected to eat your meal with a snorkel and a mask on. And, for reasons no one can understand, the entire event is lit by black lights to make it seem like you're eating dinner under the ocean. Some neighbors have politely declined, but Martin gets upset if you don't attend, and will show up at your door the next day with seashells and conch shells, insisting you need to reconnect with the sea. It's become an ongoing nightmare for everyone on the block, and we all have our excuses ready to avoid the next invite. Story 15. There's this family down the street with a teenage son named Kyle who's decided to turn his house into a haunted mansion. It started small. He'd hang up a few fake cobwebs at Halloween, but soon he went full-on overboard. Kyle converted the entire top floor of his house into what he calls the spooky zone. He filled every room with fake skeletons, fog machines, and creepy sound effects. But what really makes it insane is that he refuses to let anyone enter the house during his spooky hours, which, of course, are every evening between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. People who walk by his house during those hours are treated to the full experience. The windows are covered with black cloth, flickering lights come from inside, and you can hear eerie laughter and chains dragging on the floor. It's not even that he's doing this for Halloween. He does it year-round. He even has a haunting schedule that he hands out to everyone, where he announces the dates and times he'll be conducting his spooky rituals. One time, I made the mistake of walking past during one of his sessions, and Kyle, wearing full zombie makeup, jumped out from behind a bush and screamed at me. It took me a full minute to process what happened before I realized I was not being attacked by a real zombie. The whole thing is like living next door to a Halloween-themed horror, and no one knows when or if it's ever going to stop. Story 16. There's a neighbor down the block, Simon, who I can't even begin to explain. He has this strange obsession with creating mood environments in his front yard, but it's not what you might think. He doesn't have a nice flower garden or a water feature. No. Simon has a rotating setup of theme-based scenes that look like they belong in a theme park or a movie set. It all started when he decided to recreate the 1960s. One summer, his front lawn was filled with psychedelic decorations, inflatable peace signs, and a disco ball that spun during the day. He would play music from that era on a speaker, and people would randomly stop by thinking it was a public event. That phase lasted for a couple of months, and then, seemingly overnight, Simon switched things up. One day, we woke up to find his front yard had transformed into a medieval village. There were makeshift stone walls, made out of wooden shields hanging on trees, and even a wooden castle that he'd built using leftover scrap. He sat out front every day, pretending to be a knight. But the real shock came when Simon decided to bring in a live-action element. He bought a set of sheep and let them roam freely in his village. The sheep weren't exactly thrilled, though, and one day they escaped and caused a small traffic jam in the neighborhood. Of course, Simon didn't stop there. Recently, I noticed a giant space-themed installation taking over his front lawn, complete with fake planets, asteroids, and a small cardboard rocket ship. He's claiming he's working on recreating a lunar colony, and apparently this phase is going to last a while. Honestly, I'm starting to wonder if Simon ever plans to leave his front yard or if we'll just have to accept that he's going to keep reinventing history every few months. Story 17. I have a neighbor named Eric, and let me tell you, the guy is intense about his diet and exercise routine. At first, it seemed pretty normal. He would go on runs in the mornings, lift weights in his garage, and eat healthy. But then it got out of hand. Eric started turning his front yard into a full-on outdoor gym. He dragged every piece of fitness equipment he owned out onto the lawn. Dumbbells, kettlebells, resistance bands, and even a pull-up bar. But it didn't stop there. He got creative. He started creating obstacle courses. He built a wall to climb, a series of balance beams, and even a tire flip station. Every day at 6 a.m., Eric would wake up and blast motivational workout music from giant speakers, instructing the neighborhood, whether they liked it or not, to join him for the daily challenge. Sometimes he'd get on his megaphone and announce things like, "The human body is a machine. Time to unlock your full potential." It was like living next door to a boot camp. At first, people just awkwardly waved and kept walking. But then Eric started setting up free fitness classes. One weekend, I got an unsolicited invite, and thinking it was just a casual group workout, I showed up. Big mistake. The entire event was a grueling 2-hour session of burpees, sprints, and mind-over-body exercises that left me sore for days. The worst part? If you didn't participate fully, Eric would give you a gentle encouragement speech. The guy's relentless, and no one knows how to make him stop. I think the worst day was when he set up a mountain climbing challenge by filling his front yard with rock piles and forcing anyone who walked by to scale the mountain for self-improvement. Eric's turned into this local legend for all the wrong reasons. And now when I go out, I make sure to take the long way around. Story 18. Our neighbor, Todd, has a very special relationship with his lawn. And by special, I mean it's borderline obsessive. For the past 5 years, Todd has been experimenting with different ways to grow the perfect grass. At first, it seemed harmless enough. He would mow his lawn every day, edging the grass with a ruler, making sure every blade was uniform in height. But things started to get really weird when Todd began introducing what he called his lawn chemicals. He'd mix up concoctions of fertilizer, water, and other mystery ingredients, and spray them all over his yard at dawn. He would stand in the middle of the lawn, looking like a mad scientist, checking the grass's progress every hour. Then came the day he started planting rare grass species. He bought grass from all over the world, convinced that the key to the perfect lawn was diversity. He would take samples of grass from every country and painstakingly plant them in different sections of his yard. Each patch was labeled with a tiny flag from the country of origin, and Todd would talk about each variety as if it were a prized possession. "This is the fescue from the foothills of Mount Fuji. The color is unmatched," he'd say. We all humored him, but then the results started to show. His lawn, which once was just your average patch of grass, began to look like an art exhibit, with grass varieties in every shade of green and texture imaginable. But the strangest thing happened when Todd started competing with other neighbors. He'd set up a lawn competition in his front yard, where anyone could come and see whose grass was the best. He even bought a lawnmower shaped like a race car to add to the fun. The competition was fierce, but I'm pretty sure Todd is the only one who cares. Now, whenever I go past his house, I feel like I'm walking through an ancient grass museum. Story 19. I've got a neighbor named Janet, who's definitely not your average person. She decided a couple of years ago that she would start a collective art project in her yard. What began as a small collection of random statues quickly evolved into a bizarre gallery of mixed media art. There are sculptures made of metal, piles of old newspapers, crates of used clothes, and random objects like broken radios and abandoned bicycles. But what really takes the cake is Janet's love for mannequins. She's got at least 30 mannequins scattered throughout her yard, and each one is dressed in different clothes. Some of them are holding signs, others have objects placed on their heads, and one is even skateboarding on a tiny wooden board she made herself. At first, we all thought it was a weird phase, but the real kicker came when Janet started holding open house events for people to come and appreciate her yard art. She even gave out pamphlets to neighbors, inviting them to explore the exhibits. Every month, she changes up the display, sometimes adding new pieces she finds at garage sales or thrift stores, and once in a while, she brings out a giant painting of herself, wearing an outfit made entirely of aluminum foil, called Reflecting Society. I don't even know where she finds these things, but her yard has become a local attraction. People come by just to take photos of the strange installation, and Janet happily offers tours. I've been on one of these tours, and let me tell you, there's something unsettling about being led through a yard of broken mannequins, discussing the philosophy of excess over a cup of herbal tea. The whole thing has started to feel like a never-ending avant-garde performance, and I can't tell if I'm part of the show or just an unwilling audience. Story 20. I have this neighbor, Phil, who has recently gone off the deep end with an obsession he calls extreme gardening. It started when he decided that traditional gardening was too boring and not adventurous enough. So he began planting all sorts of dangerous and bizarre plants in his yard, thorny bushes, venomous-looking cacti, and even a patch of poison ivy. He'd talk about embracing the wild and how these plants were more natural than the carefully manicured flowers people usually grow. But Phil didn't stop there. He started designing survival courses in his yard, where he would challenge the neighborhood kids to climb through these dangerous plant patches or crawl under barbed wire to reach a treasure chest filled with, well, mostly rocks. He started offering survival training classes to any brave soul willing to join him. though his idea of training was running through the yard, blindfolded while avoiding the thorny bushes. The kids in the neighborhood started referring to his backyard as the jungle, and while some of them were excited by the idea of adventuring, most parents were not thrilled. One afternoon, my friend's dog got caught in a patch of thorny bushes, and Phil came running out only to proclaim, "This is the natural order of things." To this day, I'm not sure if he's just playing some twisted game, or if he's genuinely lost his mind, but now his backyard has become a no-go zone for most of us. Yet somehow, I get the feeling Phil's just getting started with his next big gardening experiment. Story 21. There's this guy named Tom who moved into the house next to mine about a year ago. At first, I thought he was just a quiet guy, maybe a little socially awkward, but I couldn't have been more wrong. It all started when he put up a giant "Welcome to Tom's Zoo" sign in his front yard. I thought it was a joke, but then I noticed he had started collecting animals. No, not in the conventional sense. Tom has created his own wildlife sanctuary in his yard, and it's bizarre. It began with a few chickens, which I thought was harmless, but then he expanded his operation. He got ducks, geese, and even a few goats. One day, I looked out my window to see Tom sitting in the middle of his lawn, wearing camouflage, whispering to a goose like it was his best friend. He even set up little habitats for each animal, giving them names and personalities. I swear one of the goats had a tiny sweater. And then, as if that wasn't strange enough, Tom started hosting wildlife therapy sessions in his yard. He'd invite the neighborhood to come sit with the animals, pet them, and talk about their feelings. Of course, no one in the neighborhood knew how to respond. People would politely nod and make excuses to leave, but Tom would insist that the animals were very therapeutic. One day, I had to take a detour just to avoid walking past his house because I didn't want to get roped into a therapy session with a goat named Gerald. The strangest part is that I haven't seen Tom with any animals outside his yard, which makes me wonder if he's really just playing this elaborate game or if he's genuinely living in his own little zoo universe. Story 22. I live next to a lady named Rebecca, and I'm pretty sure she's living in a different decade, one that revolves entirely around the 1980s. At first, it was just little things: neon-colored patio furniture, leg warmers, and a record player that she'd have on full blast playing 80s hits. But then, things escalated when she started turning her garage into what she calls the retro. She's got it stocked full of vintage arcade machines, posters from old movies, and even a disco ball hanging from the ceiling. Every Friday night she hosts Retro Game Night, where she invites the entire neighborhood to come play Pac-Man, Space Invaders, or whatever other old-school games she's collected. Now, this would be fine if it wasn't for the fact that Rebecca doesn't just play the games. No. She dresses up in full 80s regalia. Think off-the-shoulder sweatshirts, big hair, and those giant plastic earrings, and insists that everyone else do the same. It doesn't matter if it's 30 degrees outside or if people are already running late to dinner. She'll knock on your door and tell you that you're missing out on the best Friday night ever. She's even started creating themed events where people have to dress up like they're in a John Hughes movie or attend a neon light gala where everything in her yard is lit up in flashing colors. I once tried to decline, and she handed me a pink tutu and said, "You'll feel the magic once you're in character." It's become a thing now. Every week we try to think of new ways to politely avoid her game nights, but no one has the heart to tell her she's not living in 1985 anymore. Story 23. There's a family on my street with a teenage daughter named Katie, who's, well, let's just say, she's the embodiment of every extreme social media influencer stereotype. At first, it was just her posting selfies on her front lawn in various poses. But things took a dramatic turn when she started live streaming her entire life. Katie decided that her yard would be the backdrop for what she calls the ultimate reality show. She set up a massive camera rig in her front yard and would do things like host Q&A sessions with random strangers, or film herself living her best life, which mostly consisted of running around with her friends in oversized sunglasses and pretending to eat salads. But it didn't stop there. Katie started inviting random people from the internet to collaborate with her on weird challenges, which often involved pranking neighbors, creating odd art installations, and making bizarre TikTok dances. The best part? Katie decided that the entire neighborhood had to participate. So, she started knocking on doors and asking if people would be willing to be part of her next live challenge. Some neighbors agreed, mostly because they didn't know how to say no without feeling rude. One time, I was dragged into a random neighbor scavenger hunt where I had to find items like a rubber chicken and a single shoe, none of which were mine, while Katie screamed, "You're on camera!" and her followers voted on whether I was winning. She once even hosted a 24-hour stay-in-the-car challenge, in my driveway, forcing everyone to stay in their cars for 24 hours, which she then lives through. I eventually had to make up an excuse and drive off to avoid being trapped in her next big idea. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending I'm not being filmed for some weird reality show. Story 24. Our neighbor Ben is one of those people who just can't let go of the past, but his past isn't what you might expect. You see, Ben is obsessed with the idea of living like it's the early 1800s, and I'm not exaggerating. It started with him dressing like a gentleman from the Regency era. Think powdered wig, a frock coat, and cravat. Every time I saw him, he'd walk around with a cane, and sometimes I'd see him practicing the perfect bow on his front. He didn't stop at just changing his clothes. Ben decided that he was going to transform his entire life. He built a small Victorian garden in the backyard, filled with plants that looked like something out of a Jane Austen. But what really took things over the top was when Ben decided to stop using modern appliances. He had a blacksmith build him a metal stove for cooking, and he actually gave up using electricity in favor of gas lamps that he keeps lit outside at all times. He even installed a wooden well in his front yard because, according to him, it was more authentic than modern plumbing. Ben talks about how much he loves the simplicity of the 1800s, but I've heard him complaining about how hard it is to find authentic teacups from that period. A couple of months ago, he hosted a Regency ball in his backyard, and everyone on the block was expected to wear formal period clothes. When I refused, he showed up at my door with a dress he thought might fit, and insisted I try it on. Now, every time I see him, he's trying to convince me to join him for a traditional hunting expedition, which, for the record, is just him wandering around the neighborhood with a walking stick and an old-timey rifle. It's honestly impressive how committed he is, but I don't know how much more of this 1800s life I can take. Story 25. Have you ever met someone who is too into vintage technology? That's Tim, my neighbor. Tim is convinced that modern technology is ruining society, so for the last few years, he's been on a mission to bring back every outdated gadget he can find. It started innocently enough with him buying an old rotary phone and insisting that it was the only true way to communicate. But soon, Tim's obsession took over. He began collecting everything from typewriters to vintage televisions, and then it turned into him completely disconnecting from the internet. He even stopped using a microwave, claiming it was unhealthy, and that food should be cooked the old-fashioned way. Tim got so caught up in his quest for vintage tech that he installed a 1950s-style home office in his living room, complete with an old, bulky desktop computer that runs on dial-up. He insisted that I join him in this tech-free renaissance. And at one point, he gifted me a set of old encyclopedias instead of a birthday present. The weirdest part? Tim started hosting vintage gadget parties every month, where everyone was expected to bring their oldest, most outdated electronics and discuss how much better life was when things were simpler. The last party involved a room full of people listening to a record player, eating dinner by candlelight, and using fax machines to communicate across the room. It was like being trapped in a time warp. Now, Tim's been trying to convince me to get rid of my phone and embrace the true freedom of carrying around a pager. He even told me I'd be happier if I bought a vintage camera, saying it would help me appreciate the moment. I'm afraid the guy might actually be onto something, but I'm not about to start faxing my friends just yet. Story 26. I have a neighbor, Pete, who has a rather unusual obsession with, well, customizing his mailbox. And when I say customizing, I mean he has taken the concept of a simple mailbox and transformed it into a full-blown art project. It all started innocently enough. Pete painted his mailbox a vibrant blue, and it looked nice. But then, he began to experiment with adding quirky elements like a pair of googly eyes on top, a set of LED lights to make it shine at night, and an ever-changing theme depending on the time of year. I've seen him transform it into a UFO for Halloween, complete with a flying saucer and little green aliens. In December, it was a giant snowman mailbox with a carrot nose that actually lit up. But it didn't stop there. Pete started taking requests from the neighborhood. For his next creation, he decided to build a time machine mailbox, complete with rotating gears and a dial that had no purpose other than to make it look like it was from the future. One day, he was out there using a blowtorch to shape a piece of metal into a steampunk mailbox. At one point, he decided to install a working sound system inside the mailbox, so it would play music when you opened. But the music was always something strange, like a looping jingle about the importance of delivering happiness. The final straw was when he decided that the mailbox should actually serve as a performance art piece. He set up a camera near the mailbox, so when someone came to retrieve their mail, Pete would be waiting nearby, narrating their actions like it was an important public event. I've learned to avoid Pete's mailbox at all costs, but part of me admires the man's commitment to turning a mailbox into a living, breathing art installation. Story 27. I live next to Sarah, who has what can only be described as an obsession with collecting old, abandoned furniture. I first noticed it when I saw a couch sitting in her front yard one day. At first, I assumed it was just a temporary thing. Maybe she was waiting for someone to come pick it up. But the next week, another piece appeared, an old wooden rocking chair. And then came a vintage dresser, followed by a battered coffee table. Soon enough, Sarah's entire front yard was full of mismatched, weathered furniture that had no place being outside. But she didn't stop there. Every piece was painstakingly cleaned, restored, and treated with the utmost care, as if each one was a priceless antique. Sarah would often sit outside for hours, working on refinishing a chair or adding new cushions to a couch. She claimed that each piece had a story and that her collection was a tribute to forgotten furniture. Over time, Sarah started inviting people over for furniture appreciation gatherings, where she would show off the pieces, giving detailed histories of their past owners, who she made up, of course. I attended one of these gatherings reluctantly, and I found myself sitting in an ancient armchair while Sarah passionately explained how this chair once belonged to a writer from the early 1900s, and he wrote 3 novels while sitting. The chair was so old, I'm pretty sure it was just a random yard sale find, but Sarah insisted it had a rich history. The kicker came when Sarah started putting up a sign in her yard that read, "The Great Furniture Sanctuary, open for tours." Tourists actually started stopping by to take pictures of her furniture. It's a little embarrassing, honestly. Sarah's become something of a local legend, and I can't help but feel a little sorry for her neighbors who have to stare at her growing furniture empire every day. Story 28. There's a guy down the street, Gary, who I can only describe as a DIY mad scientist. For years, Gary has been obsessed with building bizarre contraptions in his garage. It started innocently enough. One day, I saw him building a wooden shelf and thought, hey, that's not too bad. But then the creations started getting more and more ridiculous. First, he made a mechanical arm that could reach out and grab items from across the room, which, of course, didn't work as planned and often knocked things over. Then, he built a robotic vacuum that didn't actually clean anything, but instead just wandered aimlessly around the house, crashing into walls and spinning in circles. The real fun began when Gary decided to build a self-watering plant system. He attached a series of pipes and hoses to his plants, but instead of using a normal watering method, he had it all connected to a small windmill that powered the system. The windmill spun in the breeze, sending water to the plants, but it was entirely too powerful. His plants started drowning in the water, and every now and then, I'd see Gary out there, frantically trying to rescue them. As if that wasn't enough, Gary decided to take things to the next level by building an automated trash collector that would drive down the street and pick up people's trash bins for them. The thing would only work half the time, and when it did work, it often dumped trash everywhere. It's like living next to a mad scientist who somehow thinks the solution to every problem is a ridiculous invention. The worst part is, he's always asking neighbors to test his latest creation. I once spent an afternoon stuck in a seatbelt that he installed in a testing chair that was supposed to be a new type of car seat. I felt like I was in an episode of a bizarre game show. And to be clear, I was never paid in any way for these experiments. Story 29. If you're familiar with the term extreme sports, you might think of snowboarding or skydiving. But my neighbor Chris has a very different definition. Chris has turned his backyard into what I can only describe as a personal, extreme sports arena in which he practices every sport possible, but in the most unconventional and dangerous ways. He started by installing a zip line across his yard that went from the top of his garage to a tree in the neighbor's yard. I thought it was cool at first, but then he started launching himself off of it while holding a bicycle. He'd soar through the air on his bike and land on a giant inflatable mattress that was strategically placed in the yard. But that was only the beginning. Next, Chris built a ramp that launched him off his backyard fence and straight into a pile of foam blocks, because apparently that's safer than just climbing over it normally. He also started practicing backyard extreme frisbee, where he would throw a frisbee and leap into the air to try to catch it, while also doing flips. The real crowd pleaser came when he decided to build a slip and slide that was 20 feet long and had a jump ramp at the end. He'd go flying down it, trying to do stunts like barrel rolls or attempting to land on a trampoline. One day, I walked by just in time to see him crash through a small wooden fence and land in the neighbor's flower bed. That was when his extreme days came to an end, or so I thought. But no, Chris just moved the whole operation to his front lawn. Now he practices his extreme lawn bowling in the middle of the day, making every visitor nervous as he rolls giant boulders across his yard, trying to knock down target pins he's set up in random places. Honestly, it's hard to tell if he's having fun or just causing chaos, but either way, it's impossible to ignore. Story 30. My neighbor Tim is a man on a mission. Though, to be honest, I'm still not sure what his mission is. For the past few years, he's been on an obsessive journey to convert his entire house into a self-sustaining haven. It all began with him growing vegetables in his backyard, which seemed nice at first. But then, he decided that every part of his house had to be green, in the most literal sense. He built a full-on vertical garden on his garage, planted vines along every window, and even rigged his roof with solar panels and wind turbines. What's odd is that Tim doesn't just focus on his backyard. He's started trying to convert the entire neighborhood. He's put up flyers urging everyone to live off the grid and frequently knocks on doors to discuss how we can all become self-sufficient. The most bizarre part? He decided to build a small eco-village in his front yard, complete with a tiny composting toilet, a rainwater collection system, and a garden shed. The shed, though, is less of a shed and more of a replica of a sustainable village house, with walls made of recycled plastic bottles. Tim even put a sign in front of his house that says, "The Eco Project, visit for free tours." I had to take one of these tours once when he cornered me in my driveway and insisted I come learn about sustainable living practices. It wasn't so much a tour as it was a lecture on how I could get rid of all modern luxuries. Apparently, my air conditioning was the source of all my problems. So now, every time I walk out of my house, I'm greeted by Tim handing me more pamphlets and asking if I've thought about living off the grid. At this rate, I'm waiting for him to build an entire eco-village on my lawn next. Story 31. My neighbor Steven has a very specific hobby that I never thought anyone could get this obsessed with: collecting shopping carts. I know it sounds harmless, but over the years, Steven has amassed an entire collection of them from various stores. Grocery stores, hardware stores, you name it. At first, I thought he was just using them to carry heavy bags of groceries, but then I started noticing that the carts were multiplying in his yard. I watched as he started customizing each cart, painting them bizarre colors, and adding little signs on them with names like the Purple Fury and the Iron Beast. He lined them up along his fence like they were part of some strange army. And every few weeks, Steven would host what he called a cart parade, where he'd push each cart down the block one by one, while playing circus music on a loudspeaker. The entire neighborhood was forced to participate, or else risk receiving a friendly reminder from Steven. Things got even weirder when he decided to create a shopping cart garden. Instead of planting flowers or vegetables, Steven carefully arranged potted plants inside each of his carts, creating little miniature worlds that seemed to have no purpose at all. Every time I walked by, I could see Steven kneeling down, admiring each cart like it was a rare artifact. I tried to talk to him about it, but he just told me it's a lifestyle choice. Last month, I was walking my dog when Steven came up to me with a shopping cart that had a giant inflatable dinosaur in it, and he said, "It's a symbol of freedom." I don't know how much longer I can take this. The carts are starting to overrun his entire front yard.